Wash this pile of dishes. Then I'll let you taste the caviar. My daughter-in-law said that right in the middle of a wedding that cost millions of dollars. Hundreds of guests were standing there with glasses of wine, all staring at my wife. A dirty apron was tossed onto the table. The live stream cameras were still running. My wife Molly, the woman who spent her whole youth working in kitchens so our son could go to college, stood there in silence. She didn't say a word. What shocked me the most wasn't Jessica. It was Daniel, my son. He looked straight at his mother and said, "Mom, just do it. Don't embarrass me. Before I tell you what happened next that night, let me ask you something. Tell me where you're listening from by leaving a comment below. I'm always curious to know where in the world my story is reaching. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, please subscribe to the channel. Now, let me tell you what happened. Right after those words were spoken, the glass of wine in my hand trembled slightly. No one at our table said a word for several seconds. All we could hear was the soft music from the band out on the lawn and the wind from the ocean moving through the low trees around the garden of the estate. The wedding was being held at a massive mansion in the Hamptons. People said it cost several $1,000,000. I don't know the exact number. I only know that everything here was excessive. A white reception tent, as tall as a theater. Hundreds of hanging lights sparkling above us. Tables and chairs covered in pure white linen. And far in the distance, where my wife and I had been seated, tall hedges had been trimmed so high they almost blocked the view of the stage. That was our spot. Not near the family, not near the bride and groom, but all the way at the edge of the garden, where the servers usually walked by. Molly sat beside me, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She was wearing a simple blue dress. I knew she had chosen that dress a long time before today. She once asked me, "Do you think it's too plain?" I told her no. But when I looked around that evening, at the expensive gowns and the custom-tailored suits, I understood exactly why Jessica wanted us sitting here. I turned to Molly. She still looked calm. Only her eyes were lowered slightly, as if she was trying not to notice the looks from the people around us. Up near the front, Jessica was still standing there in her glittering wedding dress. Someone's phone camera was still pointed at our table. A few guests had begun whispering. Daniel stood beside her. My son looked sharp in his black tuxedo. His hair was perfectly styled, his tie flawless. He looked exactly like the kind of successful man I used to see on the covers of financial magazines. But in that moment, he didn't look like the boy Molly used to walk to school every morning. Jessica folded her arms, as if she were waiting. "The kitchen is a mess," she said loudly, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. The serving staff just walked out. Nobody wants to work. A few guests exchanged looks. I had overheard earlier that something had happened in the kitchen. Something about payment, maybe an argument, maybe something else. But an entire catering team disappearing right before the main course. That was not something anyone expected at a wedding like this. Jessica lifted her chin toward Molly. "You used to work in kitchens, right?" she asked, her voice soft but cold. Not everyone here knew that. But Jessica's family had clearly done their homework about us. Molly nodded gently. "I used to help in kitchens for a few families," she said quietly. Jessica smiled. Not the smile of someone grateful. It was the smile of someone who had just found a new form of entertainment. "Well, that works out perfectly," she said. One of Jessica's friends standing nearby let out a quiet laugh. Jessica picked up a dirty apron from a tray a staff member had just left behind. She shook it lightly in her hand, as if examining some strange little object. Then she placed it on the table in front of Molly. "There's a mountain of dishes in the kitchen," Jessica said. "If you wash them, I'll let you taste the caviar tonight." A few scattered laughs rose from the nearby tables. I clearly heard the word beluga. They had been advertising that dish all evening. One of the most expensive types of caviar in the world. I turned to look at Daniel. My son didn't look surprised at all. He exhaled softly, as if this were nothing more than a minor problem that needed solving. "Jessica," I said slowly. But before I could finish the sentence, Molly placed her hand on my wrist. Her touch was very light. "It's all right," she said. Jessica was still watching. And Daniel finally spoke. "Mom, just do it," he said, his voice low but clear. "Don't make this awkward." I looked at my son. There are moments in a father's life when he realizes he no longer understands his own child. That was one of those moments. Molly stood up. Not fast, not slow. She picked up the apron, folded it once, and draped it over her arm. A few guests watched in silence. Others looked away, as if they didn't want to be involved. "Where's the kitchen?" Molly asked. Jessica tilted her head toward the main house. "Through the glass hallway," she said. "You'll hear the dishes." Molly nodded. She walked across the garden, past the white-covered tables, heading toward the large kitchen behind the mansion. I watched her go. A man sitting at our table leaned toward me and whispered, "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding." I didn't answer. I've lived long enough to know that some silences are not misunderstandings. They are choices. I stood up. No one stopped me as I followed Molly into the house. When the glass door closed behind us, the sound of the party outside faded away. The kitchen was almost as big as our entire home, but it wasn't quiet inside. Control screens were blinking. A few chefs were arguing tensely with technical staff. Rows of trays filled with expensive ingredients lined the steel counters. And in the middle of all that chaos, Molly stood still for a few seconds. She looked around the kitchen, not like a guest, but like someone who once understood places like this very well. Molly stood still for a moment, in the middle of that enormous kitchen. The white ceiling lights reflected off the cold steel counters. The air smelled of sea salt, melted butter, and smoked fish. But instead of the familiar rhythm of a working kitchen, knives, tapping pans, moving, all I heard were tense voices and the intermittent beeping of control screens. A young chef stood in front of a touchscreen panel, tapping rapidly. Nothing happened. "It won't open," he said to a man in a suit who was holding a phone. "All the ovens are locked." A nearby screen flashed red lines of text I couldn't fully read from where I stood. Molly walked slowly toward a row of sinks. There were stacks of unused dishes there, already prepared for the main course of the evening. Small silver spoons for the caviar rested neatly in velvet trays. She placed the apron on the edge of the counter, but she didn't put it on. Instead, she looked around the kitchen again. "Why won't the ovens open?" Molly asked. Her voice wasn't loud, but a few people turned toward her. The man in the suit sighed. He was probably the event manager. "The mansion's smart kitchen system is locked," he said quickly. "All the equipment is connected to a central server. Someone blocked the control access." "Just temporary?" Molly asked. The man shook his head. "We called technical support," he said. "They told us the system has been encrypted." I had heard that word before. Not in a kitchen, but in stories about companies being held hostage by technology. Molly looked up at the screens. One of them displayed the temperatures of the large refrigeration units. The numbers were blinking, irregular. "What's inside those?" she asked. One of the chefs answered almost immediately. "Fish, meat, and caviar," he said. "A lot of it." He paused, then added quietly, "If the refrigerators become unstable, everything could spoil." Nobody needed to explain further. I understood exactly what that meant. A wedding that cost millions of dollars could turn into a very awkward silence, just because a kitchen system stopped working. Outside, I could still hear music drifting in from the garden. The guests probably had no idea what was happening in here. Molly walked toward one of the large ovens. The glass was dark. She placed her hand gently against the metal door. "They're not hot," she said. A young technician looked up. "They can't be turned on," he said. "The central system locked everything." "What about the mechanical valves?" Molly asked. The young man stared at her, as if he wasn't sure he heard correctly. "Mechanical valves," Molly nodded. "Ovens used to have safety valves," she said calmly. "When the electronics failed, people could still control the pressure." The technician shook his head. "This system is fully automated," he said. "Everything runs through software." I saw Molly frown slightly. Not from worry, more like a craftsman trying to understand a complicated machine. On the other side of the kitchen, a group of people walked in. Jessica was leading them. Her glittering wedding dress looked completely out of place in the cramped kitchen, but she didn't seem to care. Daniel followed behind her, along with an older man I assumed was Jessica's father. "What's going on?" Jessica asked. The event manager hurried over. "The kitchen system is locked," he said. We're trying to fix it. Jessica looked around the room. Her eyes stopped when she saw Molly standing near the oven. A thin smile appeared. "Oh," she said. "You've already started." No one in the kitchen laughed. Daniel stood beside her, his hands in his pockets. "Jessica," he said quietly. "Not now." She crossed her arms. "This is exactly the moment," she said. "Our reception is being delayed." Her father turned to the manager. "How long until it's fixed?" The manager hesitated. "We don't know yet." That answer made the air in the kitchen feel heavier. Jessica turned back to Molly. "Looks like you'll be washing dishes longer than expected," she said. Molly didn't answer. She was studying a small control panel mounted on the side of the oven. Lines of text and numbers were moving across the screen. I stepped closer. "What do you see?" I asked quietly. Molly pointed gently at a blinking symbol. "The pressure inside the system is rising," she said. One of the chefs turned quickly. "That's impossible," he said. "The ovens are off. They're off on the screen," Molly said. "But the heat inside is still being trapped." She glanced up toward the ceiling, where steel pipes ran along the kitchen line. "And if the valves don't open," she said slowly. The young technician suddenly stopped typing. "Wait," he said. He looked at the data on his screen, then turned to the manager. "The system temperature really is rising," he said. The event manager frowned. "What does that mean?" The technician swallowed. "If the pressure keeps increasing, the system could shut itself down." "Shut down how?" Jessica asked. He didn't answer right away. Molly turned toward me. Her eyes were calm. "Maybe we should open the back doors of the kitchen," she said softly. I looked at her. I've lived with Molly for more than 40 years. I know that voice. That's the voice she uses whenever a kitchen is about to have trouble. And the thing that stayed in my mind wasn't the blinking screens. It was something else. In the corner of the room, near the kitchen's control server, a short line of text appeared on a black monitor. It wasn't an error message. It looked more like a note. Short, deliberate. Someone had locked this entire system, not by accident, but because they wanted to. No one in the kitchen spoke for a few seconds after Molly mentioned the pressure. The screens kept blinking. The numbers changed slowly, but steadily. I'm not a cook, but I worked with machinery for nearly 40 years, and when a system starts building pressure on its own, with no one controlling it, that's never a good sign. The young technician leaned closer to the screen. "The steam line pressure is increasing," he said, "but the software won't allow the release valves to open." "Then open them manually," Molly said. He shook his head immediately. "There's no manual mode," Jessica sighed, clearly losing patience. "I don't care how the system works," she said. "I just want this reception to continue." Her father stood quietly behind her, his arms folded. He didn't speak, but his eyes moved from one screen to another. Molly was still standing in front of the large oven. She didn't touch the control panel again. Instead, she leaned down slightly and looked toward the metal base. "Here," she said. No one reacted at first. I walked closer. Molly pointed to a small panel near the bottom of the oven. "This is a pressure inspection port," she said. The young technician stepped forward and knelt down to look. "That can't be right," he said. "I've never seen this in the design plans." "That's because it's not for the software," Molly said calmly. "It's a mechanical backup valve." The technician touched the edge of the panel, trying to open it, but it wouldn't move. "It's locked," he said. Jessica crossed her arms. "I thought you came here to wash dishes," she said dryly. Molly didn't respond. She simply looked at me. That look was enough for me to understand what she was thinking. I stepped closer to the oven. After years of working with machines, I developed a habit. Always look at how something is assembled before trying to open it. That small panel was held in place by 2 steel hex bolts. "Anyone have a tool?" I asked. One of the chefs quickly handed me a wrench from a drawer. I knelt down, loosened the first bolt, then the second. The metal made a dry click as the panel came loose. Inside, there was a small steel valve connected to the steam line. The technician stared at it. "We didn't know that was there," he said. "Not everyone remembers that machines need an escape route. When software fails," I said. I slowly turned the valve handle. For the first second, nothing happened. Then a soft hiss filled the air. Pressure began escaping from the pipe. Molly stood behind me. "Easy," she said. I turned the handle a little more. The hissing grew louder, but the tension in the room eased. The technician looked up at the screen. The pressure is dropping, he said. Around the kitchen, a few people let out quiet breaths of relief. But the bigger problem hadn't disappeared. The ovens were still dark, the refrigerators were still locked, and the central control system was still displaying those strange lines of text. Jessica looked at us, as if something unexpected had just happened. "So that's it?" she asked. The technician shook his head. "We only prevented the system from shutting itself down," he said. "But the equipment still won't operate." Jessica's father finally stepped closer to the control console. "How long until it's fixed?" he asked. The technician hesitated. "Maybe a few hours, if we can break the encryption." "A few hours," Jessica repeated. Outside, I could still hear music and conversation from the guests. But if the main course didn't arrive soon, silence would spread across that garden. Jessica turned toward Molly and me. Her eyes were sharper now. "I don't think the two of you came in here to fix the system," she said. I stood up and brushed off my hands. "We just didn't want this kitchen facing a bigger problem," I said. She stared at me for a few seconds. "You're an engineer, aren't you?" she asked. I nodded. "Retired," I said. Jessica didn't say anything else, but her father did. He looked straight at me, studying my face. "What field?" he asked. "Mechanical engineering?" I replied. He nodded slowly. "Interesting," he said. While they were talking, I walked toward the control server in the corner of the room. The black screen was still showing the same line of text. A short message. Not dramatic, not threatening, just a coded request for access. I looked at it more carefully. Something in the structure of the command felt familiar. Not because I understood every piece of modern technology, but because the way this system protected itself wasn't entirely digital. It felt more like a hybrid lock, part software, part mechanical logic. I looked back at the row of ovens and the metal pipes running across the ceiling. A thought slowly formed in my mind. If someone designed this system that way, then that person must have understood very well how older machines worked. I turned toward Jessica. "There's something I need to know," I said. She frowned slightly. "What is it?" I pointed toward the server. "Which company designed this kitchen system?" Jessica answered immediately, almost proudly. "My family's technology company," she said. I nodded. In my mind, an old memory shifted. Years ago, when I was still working, I had heard about a design very much like this, a design an older engineer had spent years perfecting. But in the end, the patent had been registered under a different name. I looked back at the screen once more. Then I let out a slow breath. Maybe I knew how to unlock this system. But this time, I didn't rush to say it out loud. I stood in front of the server screen for a few more seconds. Lines of characters moved slowly across the black display. It wasn't anything too complicated. At least not to someone who had spent a lifetime working with mechanical systems. But what caught my attention wasn't the code. It was the way the system had been designed. A software lock on the outside. And behind it, very old physical mechanisms. I turned toward Molly. She understood my look immediately, just like she had for the past 40 years. "What do you think?" I asked quietly. Molly looked around the kitchen again. Her eyes moved across the pressure pipes, the heat sensors, then the row of ovens we had just depressurized. "This wasn't an accident," she said. I nodded. One of the technicians was still struggling with the keyboard. "We're trying to resend access authorization," he told the event manager, his voice tense. "But the system isn't accepting it." Jessica leaned against a steel counter, her arms crossed. Some of the confidence she had earlier was fading, though the irritation was still there. "How much longer?" she asked again. No one answered right away. I stepped closer to the server. "Maybe I can help," I said. Jessica turned to look at me. There was clear doubt in her eyes. "You," she said. I didn't react to the tone. "I've worked with systems that use a similar structure," I said. Jessica's father stepped a little closer. "You're sure about that?" he asked. "I'm not sure," I answered honestly. "But I can try." Jessica let out a short breath. "Then try," she said. "As long as we don't have to wait for hours." I looked at the screen again. The system was asking for a dual confirmation sequence. Part of it existed in the software. The other part was linked to heat sensors in the mechanical system. If the designer had built it the way I suspected, then once pressure and temperature reached certain levels, the system would automatically unlock a backup access path. But that would only happen if several mechanical sensors were triggered in the correct order. I turned to Molly. Do you remember the pressure valves on the ovens over there? I asked. Molly nodded immediately. Yes, we need to open 2 more. The technician overheard us and looked over. But the system is locked, he said. Not all of it, I replied. I pointed toward the row of ovens on the right. There are at least 3 backup mechanical valves. We opened one already. 2 more are still holding pressure. The technician hesitated for a few seconds, then hurried over to check. You're right, he called out. There are 2 more here. Molly stepped forward. Let me, she said. She knelt down and opened the first panel with surprising calm. I handed her the wrench. The metal made a soft sound as the bolts came loose. Another hiss escaped when Molly turned the valve. The technician looked up at the screen. The temperature is changing, he said. The second one, I reminded her. Molly opened the last valve. This time the release sound was slightly louder, but it didn't last long. On the server screen, the warning message blinked. Then it disappeared. The entire kitchen fell silent. 1 second later, all the control panels lit up at once. Indicator lights on the ovens came back on. The refrigerators hummed to life again. The technician stared at the screen. The system is unlocked, he said. A few chefs let out relieved breaths. The event manager turned to Jessica. We can continue the reception, he said. Jessica didn't respond right away. She was looking at me, not with the mocking expression she had earlier. This time, she looked like she was rethinking something. Her father stepped closer to the server. Very interesting, he said. I was about to turn away when the large monitor at the far end of the kitchen suddenly lit up. At first, I thought it was just the system restarting, but then a folder appeared on the screen. Not the kitchen interface, a data archive. The technician frowned. This isn't part of the kitchen software, he said. Files began appearing on the display. Folder names, spreadsheets, financial reports. Jessica walked quickly toward the screen. What is that? She asked. The technician shook his head. I didn't open it, he said. Jessica's father was staring at the display now. Several titles became clearer as the system loaded the data. I recognized one phrase, Community Support Fund. Then a detailed table appeared. Transfers of money, receiving accounts. The numbers were large enough that the entire kitchen went quiet. Daniel stepped closer. Turn that off, he said quickly. The technician pressed a few keys, but the screen kept showing more. More tables appeared, a few notes beside them, event expenses, decorations, venue rental, everything marked with the same source of funding, Jessica's family company charity fund. Jessica turned sharply toward the technician. Turn it off, she said. I can't, he replied, his voice tight. The system is broadcasting from the main server. I looked at Daniel. My son's face had gone pale. He turned toward me. Dad, he said quietly. Outside, through the glass doors. I could see the large screen in the garden had also lit up. Guests at the reception were beginning to turn their heads. The numbers kept appearing. Daniel took another step toward me. Dad, what did you do? He asked. I looked at my son for a long moment before answering. I only unlocked the kitchen system, I said. Then I glanced back at the screen, where those financial tables were still appearing. As for the rest, I said slowly, those things were probably already there. No one in the kitchen said another word for several seconds. The numbers continued to scroll quietly across the large screen. There was no dramatic music, no explanation, just dry tables of data. But they were clear enough for anyone familiar with finance to understand what they were seeing. Through the glass doors, I could see several guests in the garden standing up from their tables. Some walked closer to the outdoor screen. Others took out their phones, probably calling someone. Daniel stood right in front of me. He no longer looked like the confident man who had been standing on the stage earlier. His hands trembled slightly, as if he was trying very hard to stay calm. Dad, he said quietly, you have to turn it off. I looked at my son. There's something strange about looking at the face of a child you raised. You remember every year of their life, every step they took growing up, and yet sometimes you realize you no longer recognize the person standing in front of you. Turn off what I asked. Daniel glanced up at the screen, then back at me. Those things shouldn't be here, he said. I didn't answer right away. Behind him, Jessica was speaking tensely with her father. I couldn't hear the words, but their voices were low and urgent. One of the chefs stepped toward the event manager. "Should we continue serving?" he asked. The manager looked out toward the garden for a moment, then gently shook his head. "Give it a minute," he said. I turned back to the screen. The data tables had stopped on one final page. The total amount was written there, very clearly. A large sum, large enough to keep the entire kitchen silent. Jessica's father stepped closer to the display. He read a few lines, then turned toward his daughter. "Jessica," he said, his voice lower now. She didn't answer. Jessica was staring at the numbers, as if she were trying to will them to disappear. Daniel turned back toward me. "Dad, please," he said. I looked straight into my son's eyes. I remembered the first time he learned to ride a bicycle. I remembered Molly standing at the kitchen door, calling him in for dinner when the sky had already gone dark. Those memories were still very clear. But this moment was different. "Daniel," I said slowly. "I didn't put those numbers on that screen." He stayed silent. "But you put them somewhere," I continued. "And sometimes things like that find their own way into the light." Outside in the garden, the music had stopped. A few men in suits were speaking with Jessica's father. I recognized some of them as people who worked in finance and law. They had come as guests to the wedding. The atmosphere of the evening had changed. It was no longer a loud celebration, just quiet conversations and searching looks. Jessica turned toward me again. The mockery in her eyes from earlier was gone. "What did you do?" she asked. I shook my head slightly. "Not much," I said. "I just reopened the kitchen." She stared at me for a few seconds, as if trying to understand something. Then she turned away. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder and said something quietly that I couldn't hear. Daniel stood in front of me for another moment. "I didn't think things would turn out like this," he said. I nodded. "I believe you," I said. That answer seemed to surprise him. Molly stepped over and stood beside me. She wasn't looking at the screen anymore. She was looking at Daniel. "Do you remember our little kitchen?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer. "Every morning I woke up early to make breakfast for you before school," Molly said gently. "I never imagined that one day you would feel ashamed of that." Daniel lowered his head. No one spoke after that. A few minutes later, Molly turned to me. "Let's go home," she said. I nodded. We walked out of the kitchen, through the glass hallway, and back into the garden. Many guests were standing in small groups now. Some looked at us as we passed, but no one said anything. The tables were still full of untouched food. The wedding flowers were still perfect on the stage. But that night, we had already changed direction. When we stepped out through the gate, the ocean wind drifted softly across the stone path. I heard Molly let out a long breath, like someone setting down a heavy weight. "Are you hungry?" I asked. She smiled softly. "A little." We drove away from the Hamptons estate as the lights behind us slowly grew smaller in the rearview mirror. An hour later, we were home. Our small suburban house had no chandeliers, no giant screens, and no white linen tables. Just Molly's familiar kitchen. She took 2 slices of bread, cracked a few eggs into a pan, and set the plates on the table. We sat and ate in silence for a while. Then Molly looked at me. "Do you regret it?" she asked. I thought for a moment. "No," I said. I set the piece of bread down and looked out the window. After all those years working with machines, I learned one simple thing. A machine can look perfect from the outside, but if its foundation is built on the wrong parts, sooner or later, the system will reveal its flaws. Families are the same way. Money can buy large celebrations, but it cannot buy respect. And sometimes, the most important thing a father can do is not to fix everything. Sometimes, it is simply to let the truth stand on its own. I looked at Molly eating her warm egg sandwich. She gave a small smile, and in that quiet moment, I knew we still had the most important thing of all, peace. If this story touched your heart, I hope you'll press the like button on this video. It helps the story reach more people. You can also subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next stories. And if you think this story is worth sharing, feel free to send it to a friend or someone you care about. Thank you for sitting with me and listening to my story all the way to the end. It truly means a lot.